So the early church fathers were handing down the truth. They say this over and over and over again. And the people who study the early church fathers cannot even see what they're saying. But Irenaeus, this fellow was the leading voice against the heretics in the 2nd century. So if you don't pay attention to him, you're not going to pay attention to anybody else. And he says this, now all these heretics are of much later date than the bishops to whom the apostles committed the churches, which fact I have in the 3rd book taken all pains to demonstrate. So you can go to the 3rd book. I've given you all that information, and you can read it, what he says. It follows then, as a matter of course, that these heretics aforementioned, since they are blind to the truth and deviate from the right way, will walk in various roads, and therefore the footsteps of their doctrine are scattered here and there without agreement or connection. They are blind to the truth. I'm going to tell you what Paul says about that. The vast majority of people in the church today are completely and totally blind to the truth. They see the church as a social club where they get together and feel good about doing God's will. And they are doing a God's will, but they're not doing the living God's will. That's the first thing he alludes to. But when he says, and deviate from the right way, he is pointing us back to the Old Testament. Because in the Mystery of Scripture, Volume 1, I explained to you how the way that the prophets talk about is the way of Moses. It is the teaching of Moses. I've explained that to you. And so when he talks about walking in the footsteps of others, he's saying, no, we know the truth about the way. And these heretics, they've taken off in some other direction, believing some other doctrine, and it is not what was handed down from the apostles. So he's basically saying we are in the process of handing down the truth. But the path of those belonging to the church circumscribes the whole world, as possessing the sure tradition from the apostles, and gives unto us to see that the faith of all is one and the same, since all receive one and the same God the Father, and believe in the same dispensation regarding the incarnation of the Son of God. What's he saying? He's saying we got what we got from the apostles. Now I've showed you that Jesus was teaching the truth. He was explaining it to his apostles, or to his disciples at the time. And after the day of Pentecost, the apostles were handing down the truth. It got corrupted in the 2nd century. And by the 3rd century AD, the church leaders were into full-on speculation about, well, maybe it's this, well, maybe it's that, well, maybe it's the other. And so today, you have people getting up in the pulpit saying, well, some people think this, and some people think that, and some people think the other. And you can just pick whatever you want to believe, and it'll be all right. Unfortunately, that's not belief, because you can end up believing a lie. And as far as I can tell, believing a lie will send you straight to hell, because belief in the truth is what saves. These people in the early church had a definite content. They believed that content. And as a result of that content, they had every reason to believe that God had said, if you believe what I tell you, you will be saved. And these heretics come into the church at the time of Marcion, about 145, and they're doing some really, really, really stupid things. And if you look at what's happening in the church today, they're doing exactly what Marcion did. They're cutting passages out of the scriptures. Oh, they never touched the scriptures. Well, maybe they would. Some people have shown me some really strange things going on with the Bible. You can have a Bible that's this and a Bible that's that and a Bible that's the other. Makes no sense to me, but that's what they believe. My point is, When these heretics came into the church, they gave people options. Well, you can believe this. Well, you can believe that. Well, you can believe the other. So now the tradition that was handed down from the apostles became just another way to interpret the scriptures. And then you had Clement of Alexandria and Origen come in and say, hey, this is the way you do it. It's allegorical. Everything in the Old Testament is allegorical. So you interpret it as an allegory. It's like something. It's like this. It's like that. It's like the other. Well, to a certain extent, that's true. Some parts of the Old Testament are allegorical. I call it parabolic. But that's not to say that you can take allegory and interpret for yourself. God gave it to the early church through the person of Jesus, and he expected the early church to hand it down, and within 200 years, they had lost it. But this fellow is saying the same thing we saw Paul say. All of the apostles taught in perfect agreement the things regarding the Old Testament. Those things were lost, and they were lost because people say, well, I think. Well, I think. Well, I think. And you've heard the saying, an opinion is a dime a dozen. Well, I'd give it a little bit of inflation. I don't think it's worth a dime a dozen now. As a matter of fact, it's almost worthless. He's saying they're teaching the tradition of the apostles and believe in the same dispensation regarding the incarnation of the Son of God, and are cognizant of the same gift of the Spirit, and are conversant with the same commandments, and present the same form of ecclesiastical constitution, and expect the same advent of the Lord, and await the same salvation of the complete man, that is, of the soul and body. Same. And here's a man who's writing after Marcion came up with his stupidity, and in 165, this fellow starts writing a 5-volume work against heresies. And he has just told us the early church in his day was still preaching one message. Now, over the next 45 years, the early church lost a lot of that. And if you don't think that's possible, just go back to the 1960s and see if by the end of the 1980s, the gospel has not been totally corrupted. It was. And today you'll find very few people teaching anything regarding how you may be saved. The gospel message, the basic gospel message of an evangelist. It's not out there. And undoubtedly, the preaching of the church is true and steadfast, in which one and the same way of salvation is shown throughout the whole world. For to her is entrusted the light of God, and therefore the wisdom of God, by means of which she saves all men, is declaring in its going forth. It uttered its voice faithfully in the street, is preached on the tops of the walls, and speaks continually in the gates of the city. And he's quoting Proverbs 1. Anybody know the significance of Proverbs 1 through 9? I would hope you do, because you need it. And you're going to need it. And you're going to have to heed it if you want to make it through. Because he talks about the harlot. And that's what we're dealing with. The harlot. The harlot who says, I am all that is. And those who don't believe will not be able to see through the scriptures that the harlot is not all that is. For the church preaches the truth everywhere, and she is the 7-branch candlestick which bears the light of Christ. Those, therefore, who desert the preaching of the church and call in question the knowledge of the holy presbyters, not taking into consideration of how much greater consequence is a religious man, even in a private station, than a blasphemous and impudent sophist. By sophist, he means philosopher. He understood how the teaching would be lost. And he calls him a sophist. Now such are all the heretics, and those who imagine that they have hit upon something more beyond the truth, so that by following those things already mentioned, proceeding on their way variously, inharmoniously, and foolishly. What's he saying? He's saying, arguing about everything. I think this. Well, I think that. That's the way the fools who caused the loss of the teaching are still at it today, trying to keep the truth hidden, trying to put it down, trying to make sure that their God has his way. And by their God, I mean that liar, the murderer, the killer, Satan himself. Not keeping always to the same opinions with regard to the same things, as blind men are led by the blind, they shall deservedly fall into the ditch of ignorance, lying in their path, ever seeking and never finding out the truth. And there he's alluding to what Paul said to Timothy. Always learning, but never coming to a knowledge of the truth. I find it absolutely amazing that God is always at least one step ahead of Satan. Always. He's always there. And I cannot imagine the horror that Satan must have felt when he took Judas, he entered Judas, and had Judas do the one thing that he thought would bring down the living God. And then he found out, to his great surprise, that God had accomplished the very thing that he dreaded. Because on resurrection morning, the promise brought Jesus Christ back to life. And Satan was defeated, and such a fool. He's kept at it for the past 2,000 years, still thinking he can put it over on God. It's not going to happen. So what I tell you is this: Satan is insane. He is insane. He is the epitome of insanity. So let me tell you something that you can expect. From now until the end, you can expect people to become more and more and more and more and more and more insane. Now, they used to put people away for their own safety. That's not going to happen. You are going to encounter people who are out of their ever-loving mind. They appear to be sane, but they're not. And they're going to do some very foolish things. Because Satan, at this point, all he can do is mock God. We are headed right into the new Sodom and Gomorrah. And all Satan is doing is mocking God. See what I caused? See, I made this. I created this. You say you created all these things? Well, look at what I created. That fellow is absolutely insane. And there are various forms of insanity coming on this world. I suggest to you, if you have not been born again, that you go to God humbly on your knees, begging that you be given the ability to see the truth. Because if you don't, you run a very real risk of being taken over by the spirit of insanity that is coming on this place. You may think you're thinking straight, but you won't be, because we're headed right into it. And the very fact that I'm explaining things, going to explain things today, and those of you who can understand them, see what I'm saying, should be proof positive to you God's doing it. He's finally starting to work. He's not fully working. He's not doing any great, grand, and glorious things that are visible to everybody. He's working in the minds of people to put together the truth. And those who reject it, I've seen them go, and I've seen them look back and have a absolutely bewildered look on their face, not knowing how it was that they decided to leave. Because I've told people, you walk away from this, you're not coming back. You're not coming back. And you have an opportunity to hear, you have an opportunity to understand, you have an opportunity to believe. But if you reject God's offer of salvation, I hate to even think where you're going to end up. I'm just telling you what is. It behooves us, therefore, to avoid their doctrines and to take careful heed lest we suffer any injury from them, but to flee to the church and be brought up in her bosom and be nourished with the Lord's scriptures. What is this man saying? He's saying we are teaching the way. We are teaching the way that was taught to us by the apostles. It was handed down to the early church. The apostles taught these things. We're teaching these things. The heretics don't teach these things. They teach, well, it may be this, and well, it may be that, and well, it may be the other, but they're not teaching one doctrine. They're not teaching a coherent doctrine. They're teaching all sorts of different things, and none of it really hangs together. That's what they're teaching in the church today, because the church today is the result of the early church losing the teaching of the apostles. They lost it, and they lost it within 200 years after the apostles walked the face of the earth. Now, Irenaeus, or as some say Irenaeus, was the leading church father who stood against the heretics. He defined heresy. He put down things that reveal the church today is teaching heresy. He put those things down in writing. We have those things that we can read, and we can see that he's saying the early church at my time, 165 AD, is still teaching the things that the apostles taught. We're still handing those things down faithfully. Well, this next fellow, Hippolytus, was in the running, 200 AD, to be the first pope. He lost. Now, if he had won, things might have turned out differently. But he was up in an election to become the first pope. I don't think you can get a better opinion, a better statement of fact than this man. So I'm going to show you what he said so that you will understand precisely what the church is today. As it was your desire, my beloved brother Theophilus, to be thoroughly informed on those topics which I put summarily before you, I have thought it right to set these matters of inquiry clearly forth to your view, drawing largely from the Holy Scriptures themselves as from a holy fountain, in order that you may not only have the pleasure of hearing them on the testimony of men, but may also be able, by surveying them in the light of the divine authority, to glorify God in all. For this will be as a sure supply furnished you by us for your journey in this present life, so that by ready argument applying things ill understood and apprehended by most, you may sow them in the ground of your heart as in a rich and clean soil. When he says Theophilus, you probably saw he's alluding to how Luke opens the Gospel of Luke. He says that as an allusion to what Luke wrote. But when he says, so that you may sow them in the ground of your heart as in a rich and clean soil, he is obviously alluding to Matthew 13, the parable of the sower, because Jesus explained how God works his magic in the lives of men. He sows a seed. And so the evangelists, the apostles, went out in their evangelistic capability and they sowed the seed of the truth by explaining the scriptures to people. And so this parable of the sower, it explains how different people react upon hearing the truth. And he's alluding to that. By these too, you will be able to silence those who oppose and gainsay the word of salvation. Only see that you do not give these things over to unbelieving and blasphemous tongues, for that is no common danger. But impart them to pious and faithful men who desire to live holily and righteously with fear. For it is not to no purpose that the blessed apostle exhorts Timothy and says, O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. Thou therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things that thou hast heard of me in many exhortations, the same commit thou to faithful men, who shall be able to teach others also. So he's referring back to what Paul said, what Paul wanted done. Because Paul groomed Timothy to be an apostle, to replace him in that role. And so this fellow, the first loser in the run to be pope, says these things. If then the blessed apostle delivered these things with a pious caution, which could be easily known by all, as he perceived in the Spirit that all men have not faith, how much greater will be our danger if rashly and without thought we commit the revelations of God to profane and unworthy men. He's saying, because he was trained by Irenaeus, he's saying the same thing. I could have given you a quote, another quote from his works, where he says essentially the same thing that Irenaeus says. We're handing down the tradition of the apostles, and these heretics are just raising up stupidness all over the place. Marcion, he wrote his own scriptures. He just cut out the things he didn't believe from the apostolic writings and from the Old Testament, and he just put it together and said, hey, this is the Bible. This is the only Bible I teach. And so you have this idiot down here in Georgia who says, hey, we just don't teach those things. Is there any difference? We just ignore them. We just filter through the scriptures and find the things that we want to believe. And so the wrath of God, no, it's not even anywhere to be found in the New Testament. A lie. It is to be found all over the New Testament. The wrath of God. It's in the New Testament. The God of wrath? Yes, it's in the New Testament. Did Marcion teach that? No, of course not. His was a God of love. This Old Testament God, let's forget about this, you know. Have you ever heard people talk about law and grace? You know, law and grace. What they're saying is, hey, that God, we don't talk about him. We're going to talk about this God who loves you so much he'd never send you to hell. Never mind the fact that it doesn't say God loved you. It said God so loved the world. But they don't teach that. They take it another way. And then they go on and read somebody else's mail and think that, oh, yeah, well, every time it says God loves us, that it refers to us. I'm sorry, it doesn't. It refers to the chosen. But they don't teach that. So what happened to the truth? Well, there were two things. Irenaeus talked about the sophists. There were pretenders coming up in the church, and they started earlier than 145, but by 145, they were all over the place. You had the Gnostics, who were teaching their dichotomy between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. And then you had Marcion come along and he's teaching his stupidity. Then you have Tatian come along and he's teaching his total ignorance. He was the one that brought in the whole concept that Adam and Eve were created in the image and likeness of God. But these pretenders and the philosophers between them, they brought down the truth. And the death knell was Origen. By 200 AD, the teaching was fairly well on the ropes. There were scattered believers who still believed, they continued on. But by the time you get to 400, Augustine, he's essentially saying, you know, the Spirit is already within everybody and all you have to do is be able to see the light. That's totally contrary to the scriptures, because what you have to do is you have to see the truth. You have to, first of all, hear someone explain the truth. You have to decide to believe it, and then you can see it. But the truth has to convince you, because if you are not convinced by the truth, you will never believe it. It is not my responsibility to explain the truth in terms that are simple enough for a child to understand. How do I know that? Isaiah told me. In the same chapter that he told me what I had to do in order to prepare for explaining the truth to people. So what I'm telling you is very simply this. If you hear what I say and you decide to believe it, you can be born again. But you have to believe it. You can't say, oh, I think I believe. I hope I believe. That's nothing more than the idiot Kierkegaard. Don't be a Soren, is what they said in his day, because they knew that what he was saying was stupid. They knew it beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's stupid, because what Kierkegaard taught is, if you think you believe, you believe. Don't have to have a content. No content necessary, nope. All you have to do is, I believe. And so today, people are totally indoctrinated with that. I've explained this in one of the articles. This stupid leap of faith. You have to take a leap of faith. No, what I'm telling you very simply is, when I explain these things, you have to have a willingness to believe them. And if you don't have that willingness, or you are so enamored with the harlot, you won't believe them. You'll walk right away from them. Because the winds that are blowing through that vacant space between your ears, those winds are telling you, nah, this is stupid. This is just dumbness. This makes no sense whatsoever. What I'm telling you is, it makes perfect sense. But you can't see it because you don't want to believe it.